It was a day just like any other in the sleepy town of Asheville. The sun had barely broken through the mist that often lingered over the rolling hills. David Parker stirred awake to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. At 45, his life was predictable, stable, and comforting in its routine. He lived with his wife, Lisa, and their 2 children, Matt and Emma, in a modest house on the outskirts of town. The neighbors all knew each other. Life moved at a slow, steady pace, and the biggest event in the town was usually the annual fall festival. David's day began like any other. He rolled out of bed, slipped into his robe, and headed downstairs to start the coffee maker. The smell of fresh coffee beans filled the kitchen, mingling with the crisp morning air that seeped through the windows. Lisa was still asleep, and the kids hadn't stirred yet. He cherished this quiet time, where he could sit by the window, look out at the dew-covered lawn, and enjoy a moment of peace before the day kicked into gear. As the coffee brewed, David's mind drifted back to the weekend plans. Matt had a soccer game, Emma had her ballet recital, and Lisa was excited about a new project at work. He smiled to himself, content with how life had turned out. He worked as a manager at the local hardware store, a job that wasn't glamorous but provided well for the family. He was respected in the town, known as a dependable guy who was always willing to lend a hand when someone needed it. His family was happy, healthy, and his kids were doing well in school. Life, in his mind, was good. That all changed when the knock on the door came. It was just before noon when David heard the sharp, authoritative knock at the front door. He was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for lunch, when the sound startled him. It wasn't a casual knock, a neighbor dropping by for a chat, or a delivery driver bringing a package. It was the kind of knock that made his stomach drop. He wiped his hands on a towel and headed for the door, a strange sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. When he opened the door, he saw 2 police officers standing on his porch. Their expressions were serious, their eyes scanning the interior of his home as if they expected something far more sinister than a peaceful family inside. David's heart began to race. His mind raced too, wondering what could have brought them to his doorstep. "Mr. Parker?" the taller of the 2 officers asked, though it didn't sound like a question. It was as if they already knew everything about him. David nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, that's me. Is everything okay?" The officer glanced at his partner before speaking again. "Can we come inside? We need to speak with you about something important." Lisa had just come down the stairs, and the kids were in the living room, half watching TV and half playing on their phones. They all looked up when they heard the officers' voices, sensing that something was off. David hesitated, his mind flashing through every possible reason. The police could be at his door. He'd done nothing wrong, had no criminal record, and was an upstanding citizen. What could this possibly be about? "Sure," he said, stepping aside to let them in. Lisa gave him a questioning look, but he shrugged, just as confused as she was. The officers walked into the living room, and David motioned for them to sit down. They declined, standing with an air of authority that made the room feel smaller. David's anxiety mounted as they pulled out a small folder from the briefcase one of them was carrying. "Mr. Parker, this is going to be difficult to hear," the officer began, his tone serious. "We're here about your father." David blinked, stunned by the words. His father. His father had been dead for over 30 years. The memory of the car crash that claimed his life was distant but clear. David had been only a young boy when it happened, but the image of the police officers coming to his home that day to tell his mother about the accident had been seared into his mind forever. His father's funeral, the grief, the sense of loss, it all came flooding back. What do you mean?" David stammered. "My father's been dead for years. There must be some mistake." The officer's eyes softened, but only slightly. "I'm afraid there's no mistake. Your father, Richard Parker, is alive." The room seemed to tilt. David felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Lisa gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, and the kids, sensing something major was happening, turned off the TV and stared wide-eyed at their parents. "I don't understand," David finally managed to say, his voice shaky. "There's no way. My father died in a car crash when I was a kid. We buried him." The second officer spoke up then, his voice steady. "Your father faked his death, Mr. Parker. He's been living under an alias for the past 3 decades. We've only recently discovered his whereabouts." David felt like he was in a nightmare. He looked at Lisa, hoping to see disbelief in her eyes, hoping that this was some kind of horrible mistake, but her face mirrored his own shock. The police officers weren't done yet. "Your father has been involved in a number of criminal activities since disappearing," the first officer continued. "We believe he's responsible for a string of bank robberies and other serious crimes over the years. He's been on the run for most of his life, but we finally located him, and we need your help." David's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. His father, a criminal, and alive. The man who had kissed him goodbye before leaving for work one morning, never to return, had been living some kind of secret life this entire time. It was too much to process. His head swam with the implications. Why had his father done this? How could he have abandoned them? Left them thinking he was dead all these years? I don't know what to say," David finally choked out. "I can't believe this." "I know this is a lot to take in," the officer said, his voice sympathetic now. "But we need you to come down to the station and help us. Your father is dangerous, and we need to bring him in before anyone else gets hurt." David sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his legs suddenly too weak to hold him up. Lisa was beside him in an instant, her hand on his shoulder, but even her comforting presence couldn't ground him. The world he thought he knew had just been shattered in a matter of moments. His father was alive. And not just alive. He was a fugitive, a criminal, and the police were asking David to help them capture him. The officers stood silently, giving David and his family a moment to process the news. David could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the walls of the room closing in around him. Everything he thought he knew about his life was crumbling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David looked up at the officers. "I'll come with you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do whatever I can to help." As he spoke the words, David knew that his life would never be the same again. The quiet, predictable existence he had built for himself and his family was gone, replaced by a terrifying new reality. His father's past had come back to haunt him, and there was no escaping it. David sat in the back of the police cruiser, staring out the window as the familiar streets of his town passed by in a blur. His mind was racing, trying to process the whirlwind of information that had just upended his life. His father, alive. A criminal on the run. It was impossible, inconceivable, but the police officer's grave expressions had left no room for doubt. The weight of it all was crushing, and David felt like he was sinking into a black hole of confusion and disbelief. As the car turned onto the main road leading toward the police station, David found himself lost in memories of his childhood. He had always idolized his father, Richard Parker. Richard had been the kind of man everyone in town respected. Charming, hard-working, always quick with a joke. David remembered playing catch with him in the backyard, sitting on his shoulders at parades, and watching him work on the old car in their garage. He had been larger than life, a superhero in David's eyes. And then, one day, he was gone, taken by a car accident that had left his mother shattered, and David struggling to understand why his world had suddenly turned upside down. The funeral had been a blur. David was too young to fully comprehend death, but he remembered standing beside his mother at the gravesite, surrounded by their neighbors and family, everyone dressed in black. He remembered the solemn faces, the whispered condolences, and the cold, hard truth that his father was never coming home. After that, life became a series of new normals, just him and his mother trying to figure things out without the man who had been the center of their universe. The car slowed to a stop in front of the police station, jarring David out of his reverie. The officers stepped out, motioning for him to follow. His legs felt heavy as he climbed out of the cruiser, his body moving on autopilot. He was led into the station, through a maze of desks and officers busy with their daily tasks. To them, it was just another day. To David, it felt like stepping into a surreal alternate reality. They ushered him into a small windowless room, where the walls seemed to close in on him. A table and 2 chairs were the only furnishings, the room designed for interrogation and nothing more. The officers sat across from him, their faces serious but not unkind. "We know this is a lot to take in," one of them said, the taller of the 2 who had spoken at his house. His name badge read Detective Harris, "But we need to go over everything we know about your father." David nodded, though he wasn't sure what help he could be. "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father, he's dead. I don't know how he could have faked his death. How did I not know? How did my mom not know?" Harris exchanged a glance with his partner, then leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "Your father was a smart man. From what we've gathered, he staged the car accident that supposedly killed him. He made it look like a total wreck, enough to convince the authorities. There were never any remains recovered because he wasn't in the car. He used the crash to disappear, to go underground." David shook his head, still trying to make sense of it all. But why? Why would he leave us? What was he running from? "That's where things get complicated," the other officer, Detective Morales, chimed in. "We believe your father was involved in a series of criminal activities before the accident. He got mixed up with the wrong people, robberies, money laundering, and possibly more. When things got too hot, he used the crash to escape, to start over somewhere else." David's stomach churned. This didn't sound like the father he had known, the man who had taught him to ride a bike, who had tucked him into bed at night. He couldn't reconcile the memories of his childhood hero with the man these officers were describing. "So where has he been all this time?" David asked, his voice breaking slightly. "For the last 30 years, he's been living under a new identity," Harris explained. "He's been moving from place to place, using different aliases, staying off the radar. But recently, we got a lead on him. He's been using the name Charles Henson in a town about 2 hours from here. He's kept a low profile, but we've linked him to several high-profile crimes over the years, including a bank robbery that went bad and resulted in the death of a security guard." David felt like he'd been punched in the gut. A bank robbery. A death. This was too much. How could his father have been living this life all these years without anyone knowing? Without David knowing? "We need your help, David," Morales said, his tone urgent but not aggressive. "We believe your father has gone on the run again. He's slippery, and he knows how to disappear. But he hasn't been in contact with anyone, except for you." David blinked, confused. "What do you mean? I haven't heard from him since he supposedly died." Harris pulled out a folder from the briefcase he'd brought in and laid it on the table. He opened it, revealing several grainy photos of an older man, his father, but not the man David remembered. This man was older, his hair gray, his face weathered and hardened by years of running. In some of the photos, he was standing outside a house, looking around cautiously. In others, he was walking down a street, his head down, trying not to be noticed. "There's something you need to know," Harris said, his voice quiet but steady. "Your father has been keeping tabs on you all these years." David stared at him, the words not making sense at first. What are you talking about?" Morales took over. "He's been watching you, David. He's been to Asheville multiple times over the years. We have reason to believe he's been following your life, your marriage, your kids, your job. He's been living in the shadows, keeping an eye on you without ever making contact. We found pictures of you, your family, your house. He's kept detailed records of your life." David felt the air leave his lungs. His father, the man he thought was dead, had been spying on him, watching him from the shadows. It was too much to bear. He had been living his life under the illusion that his father was gone, that he had been robbed of a father-son relationship, while all along the man had been out there, hiding and observing like some kind of phantom. But why? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why would he do that? We don't know for sure, Morales admitted. Maybe he felt guilty for abandoning you. Maybe he wanted to stay close without putting you in danger. Or maybe he wanted to see if you'd ever come looking for him. But one thing is clear, he didn't disappear from your life completely. He's been a ghost in the background. David's head was spinning. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a deep, hollow sadness. His entire life, his identity, had been built on a lie. The man he had idolized as a child, mourned as a teenager, and missed as an adult, had been living a secret life right under his nose. How could his father have done this? How could he have chosen a life of crime and deception over his family? And why, after all these years, had he never reached out, never tried to explain or make amends? The room was silent for a long moment as David struggled to keep his emotions in check. Harris and Morales watched him, giving him space to process. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David looked up at them, his voice shaky but resolute. "What do you need me to do?" Harris nodded, as if he had been expecting that response. "We need you to help us find him. He trusts you, even if he hasn't spoken to you. You're his son, and that connection could be the key to bringing him in. We believe he's desperate right now, and desperate people make mistakes. If you're willing, we want you to try and reach out to him, lure him out of hiding." David stared at the table, the enormity of what they were asking sinking in. They wanted him to betray the man who had abandoned him, who had lied to him, but who was still, at the end of the day, his father. Could he do that? Could he be the one to bring him in, knowing that his father might spend the rest of his life in prison? He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. When he opened them again, he saw the faces of his children in his mind. The life he had built, the family he had sworn to protect. His father had made his choices, but now it was David's turn to make his own. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help you find him." As the words left his mouth, David felt a deep sense of finality wash over him. There would be no going back now. Whatever happened next, his life, and the life of his father, would never be the same again. David returned home later that evening, feeling as if he were in a fog. The weight of the conversation with the detectives pressed down on him, and every step felt heavy. The sky had darkened, the sun long gone, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. It seemed surreal. Only hours earlier, he had been standing in his kitchen, thinking about mundane things like dinner and the kids' activities. Now, the world seemed completely different, fractured by the knowledge that his father was alive and had been hiding all these years. As he stepped into his house, Lisa met him at the door. Her face was filled with concern, her eyes wide with questions, but she didn't speak. She had been waiting for him, pacing the living room after he had left with the officers. The kids had gone to bed, but she stayed up, too anxious to sleep. David had barely said a word to her before leaving, and now she was desperate for answers. "David," she said softly, reaching out for him. "What happened? What did they say?" David closed the door behind him, leaning against it for support. He wasn't ready for this conversation, but he knew there was no escaping it. He had to tell her, had to explain everything. He moved past her into the living room and sank into the couch, burying his face in his hands. Lisa sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder, waiting. "It's worse than I thought," David finally said, his voice low, muffled by his hands. "So much worse." He felt Lisa tense beside him. She remained silent, waiting for him to continue, her patience unshakable. She had always been his rock, the one person he could count on no matter what. He knew he owed her the truth, but the words felt like lead in his mouth. They said my father is alive, David whispered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He faked his death. He's been living under a false identity for over 30 years. Lisa gasped, pulling her hand back in shock. What? David, that can't be true. We went to his funeral. We buried him. David nodded, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. That's what I thought too. But they explained everything. He staged the accident. He made everyone believe he died, so he could disappear. He's been running from the law this whole time, living in hiding. And now they found him. They'd been watching him for months. Lisa covered her mouth with her hand, disbelief washing over her. How could he do that? To you? To your mom? David's heart ached at the mention of his mother. She had never remarried, had lived the rest of her life mourning the man she thought was lost. She had passed away a few years ago, never knowing the truth. And now David was left with the devastating knowledge that she had been deceived. His father had chosen a life of crime over his family. And now, all these years later, David had to deal with the aftermath. They think he's responsible for a lot of crimes, David continued, his voice breaking. Bank robberies, money laundering, and even a robbery that ended in someone's death. He's been running ever since. Lisa was silent for a long time, her eyes filled with sympathy and sadness as she processed what David was telling her. She knew this would change everything. David had always spoken fondly of his father, even though his memories were distant and fragmented. To learn now that the man had been alive all these years, and a criminal, was an unfathomable betrayal. What do they want you to do? Lisa finally asked, her voice trembling. They want me to help them find him, David said, looking up at her with hollow eyes. They think he'll trust me, that I'm the key to luring him out of hiding. They want me to call him, try to get him to meet up with me. They need him alive, Lisa. He's their only lead in an investigation that's been open for decades. Lisa's eyes widened, fear creeping into her expression. David, you can't. He's dangerous. What if something happens to you? What if he's not the man you remember? He's been living this life for so long. Who knows what he's capable of? David nodded, understanding her fear. He shared it. The idea of confronting his father after all these years terrified him. The man he had loved and looked up to as a child was gone, replaced by a fugitive on the run from justice. But despite his fear, there was a part of David that needed to see his father. He needed answers. He needed to know why. I have to do it, Lisa, David said quietly. I don't have a choice. If I don't, he could disappear again. And we may never find him. The police said he's desperate. He could do something terrible if he's cornered. If I don't help, more people could get hurt. Lisa stared at him for a long time, her face a mixture of worry and sadness. She knew him well enough to know that he had already made up his mind. David was a good man, a man who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. I'm scared for you, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. But I understand. You have to do what you think is right. Just promise me you'll be careful. David nodded, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. He didn't know what the next few days would bring, but he knew he couldn't face it without Lisa by his side. She had always been his anchor, and now, more than ever, he needed her strength. The next morning, David sat in his car, parked on the outskirts of town, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. The detectives had given him his father's new number, one they had obtained through their surveillance of his recent activities. The number stared back at him from the screen, and David felt a lump forming in his throat. What was he supposed to say? How do you start a conversation with the man who had abandoned you and had faked his own death? The man who had chosen a life of crime over his family. David's heart raced as he thought about the man he would be speaking to. Was his father still the charismatic, larger-than-life figure he remembered from childhood? Or had the years of hiding and running turned him into someone else entirely? David took a deep breath and dialed the number. His hands were shaking, and his heart pounded in his chest as the phone rang. Once, twice. Then, on the third ring, someone answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end was older, rougher than David remembered, but unmistakably his father's. David's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his mind blank with the weight of the moment. This was the man he had mourned for most of his life, the man who had been the center of his world before disappearing without a trace. "Dad," David finally managed to choke out, his voice shaky. There was silence on the other end for a long time. David could almost hear his father's brain working, trying to figure out if this was real or some cruel trick. "David," his father's voice finally said, incredulity dripping from every word. "Is that really you?" David swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Yeah, Dad, it's me." There was a long pause, and when his father spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again. How did you find me?" David's mind raced. He needed to be careful. He couldn't reveal that the police were involved, that this call was a trap designed to bring him out of hiding. But as he sat there, listening to his father's voice, a voice he had longed to hear for decades, something inside him shifted. This was his chance to get answers, to confront the man who had shattered his world. "I've been looking for you," David lied, his voice steady. "I didn't know if you were still alive, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. I needed to know why. Why you left. Why you faked your death. I need answers, Dad." The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for what felt like an eternity. When his father finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "David, I can't explain it all over the phone. There are things you don't understand, things I did to protect you. But I promise, I never wanted to hurt you. I had no choice." David's anger flared. "No choice. You left me and Mom behind. You let us believe you were dead. How is that protecting us?" "I can't talk about it here," his father said, his voice tinged with desperation. "But if you meet me, I'll explain everything. Please, David, just give me a chance to explain." David's heart raced. This was what the police had been waiting for. A meeting. A chance to finally bring his father in. But as he sat there, listening to the man who had caused him so much pain, David realized that this was about more than just capturing a fugitive. This was about confronting his past, about facing the man who had shaped his life in ways he had never understood. "Where do you want to meet?" David asked, his voice cold. His father hesitated for a moment, then gave him a location. David sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, staring at his phone, trying to wrap his mind around everything that had just happened. His father had agreed to meet him, but there was a part of David that still couldn't believe any of this was real. It felt like a bad dream, one where the line between reality and nightmare blurred together. The weight of the decision he had made hung over him like a storm cloud. He had agreed to lure his father into a trap, to betray him and hand him over to the police. But could he really go through with it? The location his father had chosen for the meeting was a small, run-down diner on the outskirts of a neighboring town, about 2 hours away from Asheville. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions, where people could come and go without being noticed. It was exactly the kind of place where a man like his father would feel safe, far enough off the grid to avoid attention, yet still close enough to be accessible. David's hands gripped the steering wheel as he sat parked just a few blocks from the diner. He had arrived early, wanting to get a feel for the area, to prepare himself for what was about to happen. The detectives had followed him in an unmarked car, parked a few streets away, waiting for his signal. The plan was simple. David would meet his father, talk to him, and then, at the right moment, give the signal. The police would move in and arrest him before he had a chance to flee. But as the time for the meeting approached, doubt gnawed at David's conscience. This wasn't just some criminal. This was his father, the man who had raised him, who had been his hero before everything fell apart. Could he really betray him like this? Even after everything, after the lies and the abandonment, there was a part of David that still wanted to believe in the man his father used to be. He wanted to believe that there was a reason, a justification for the choices his father had made, something that would make sense of the mess his life had become. David sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, staring at his phone, trying to wrap his mind around everything that had just happened. His father had agreed to meet him, but there was a part of David that still couldn't believe any of this was real. It felt like a bad dream, one where the line between reality and nightmare blurred together. The weight of the decision he had made hung over him like a storm cloud. He had agreed to lure his father into a trap, to betray him and hand him over to the police. But could he really go through with it? The location his father had chosen for the meeting was a small, run-down diner on the outskirts of a neighboring town, about 2 hours away from Asheville. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions, where people could come and go without being noticed. It was exactly the kind of place where a man like his father would feel safe, far enough off the grid to avoid attention, yet still close enough to be accessible. David's hands gripped the steering wheel as he sat parked just a few blocks from the diner. He had arrived early, wanting to get a feel for the area, to prepare himself for what was about to happen. The detectives had followed him in an unmarked car, parked a few streets away, waiting for his signal. The plan was simple. David would meet his father, talk to him, and then, at the right moment, give the signal. The police would move in and arrest him before he had a chance to flee. But as the time for the meeting approached, doubt gnawed at David's conscience. This wasn't just some criminal. This was his father, the man who had raised him, who had been his hero before everything fell apart. Could he really betray him like this? Even after everything, after the lies and the abandonment, there was a part of David that still wanted to believe in the man his father used to be. He wanted to believe that there was a reason, a justification for the choices his father had made, something that would make sense of the mess his life had become. He checked his watch. It was almost time. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and then stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hitting his face as he walked toward the diner. The neon sign flickered above the door, casting a dim glow over the parking lot. There were only a few cars parked outside, and through the windows, David could see a couple of truckers sitting at the counter, their eyes glued to the small TV mounted on the wall. The place was nearly empty, just as he had expected. David hesitated for a moment at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He glanced back toward the street where the detectives were parked, knowing they were watching, waiting for him to make his move. His stomach churned with anxiety. He didn't know what he would find inside, whether his father would be the man he remembered, or if he would be someone completely unrecognizable, hardened by years on the run. With one final breath, David pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell of stale coffee and greasy food hit him immediately, a reminder of the kind of places his father had likely frequented during his years in hiding. The diner was old, the red vinyl booths cracked and worn from decades of use. The waitress behind the counter barely looked up as he entered, her eyes glazed with boredom as she refilled a customer's cup. David scanned the room, and then he saw him. Sitting in a booth at the far end of the diner, his back to the wall, was his father. David's heart skipped a beat. The man sitting there wasn't the father he remembered. He was older, thinner, his hair mostly gray now, his face lined with the deep wrinkles of someone who had lived a hard life. But there was no mistaking him. It was Richard Parker, the man who had vanished from his life all those years ago. For a moment, David just stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His father looked up, their eyes meeting across the room, and in that instant, David saw something flicker in his father's expression. Recognition, mixed with something else. Guilt, perhaps. Fear. Whatever it was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "David," his father said, his voice low and gravelly as David approached the booth. "I didn't think you'd actually come." David slid into the booth across from his father, his mind still racing, trying to piece together what he should say. His throat felt dry, And for a moment, he wasn't sure he could even speak. But then the words came, tumbling out faster than he could stop them. "You didn't think I'd come." David's voice was tight, his emotions barely contained. "You disappear for 30 years, make me think you're dead, and now you're surprised I want answers." His father didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for the cup of coffee in front of him, taking a slow sip before setting it back down on the table. His hands were shaking slightly, and David noticed for the first time how frail he looked. The years on the run had clearly taken their toll. "I know you have questions," Richard finally said, his voice quiet. "And you deserve answers. But there are things I can't tell you, things that I wish you didn't have to know." David leaned forward, his anger bubbling to the surface. "I want to know everything, Dad. Why you left, why you faked your death, why you chose this life over your family. You owe me that much." Richard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's not that simple, David. I didn't choose this life. I got caught up in something I couldn't get out of. The people I was involved with, they weren't the kind of people you could just walk away from. I faked my death to protect you, to protect your mother. If I hadn't disappeared, they would have come after both of you." David shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "So you're saying you did all of this for us? That's supposed to make it better." Richard's eyes hardened, a flash of the man David remembered from his childhood. "You don't understand what I was up against. I made mistakes, big mistakes, but I did what I had to do to keep you safe." David's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Safe? You abandoned us, Dad. Mom spent the rest of her life mourning you. I grew up without a father, thinking you were dead. Do you know what that did to us? To me?" Richard looked away, guilt written across his face. "I know," he said softly. "I know I hurt you, David. I regret every day that I had to leave. But I didn't have a choice. If I had stayed, we'd all be dead." The anger inside David flared again, but this time, it was mixed with something else. Confusion, sorrow, and a deep sense of loss. He wanted to hate his father for what he had done, but part of him still longed for the man he had idolized as a child. The man who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had taken him fishing, who had been his hero. "And what about now?" David asked, his voice trembling. "What are you running from now?" Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window, as if expecting to see someone watching them. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're still out there. The people I got involved with. They never forget. They never forgive. If they knew I was still alive, they'd come for me. And they'd come for you." David's blood ran cold at the words. He had thought this was about his father's past, about the mistakes he had made years ago. But now, it seemed like those mistakes were still very much alive, still casting a shadow over their lives. "What are you saying?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locking onto David's. "I can't stay here, David. I can't be in your life. Not while they're still out there. I need to disappear again, for good this time. And you need to forget about me." David's heart pounded in his chest. He had come here to get answers, to confront the man who had shattered his life. But now, faced with the reality of the situation, he felt more lost than ever. His father wasn't just a criminal. He was a man still running from his past, still caught in a web of danger that threatened to destroy everything. "I can't just forget about you," David said, his voice breaking. "You're my father." Richard's expression softened, and for the first time, David saw the pain in his father's eyes. "I'm sorry, David, for everything. But this is the only way. If I stay, it'll put you and your family in danger. And I can't let that happen." David sat back, his mind reeling. The weight of his father's words pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had come here for closure, but now he realized that there would never be closure. His father's past had cast too long a shadow, and there was no escaping it. Before he could respond, Richard glanced at the window again, his body tensing. "I have to go," he said abruptly, standing up from the booth. "They might already know I'm here." David's heart raced. This was the moment the police had. David's heart pounded in his chest as he watched his father rise from the booth, his movements sudden and jittery, like a man constantly looking over his shoulder. He had come to this meeting with the intention of handing his father over to the police, but now everything felt like it was spinning out of control. His father wasn't just some fugitive on the run from law enforcement. He was still running from people far more dangerous, people who had haunted his past and were now threatening David's future. Richard grabbed his jacket from the seat and looked toward the door, his face tight with urgency. "I shouldn't have come here," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's not safe." David, still seated in the booth, felt paralyzed by the conflicting emotions tearing through him. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. He had been prepared to give the police the signal, to bring this chapter of his life to a close, but now that the moment had arrived, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. "Dad, wait," David said, his voice thick with desperation. "You can't just leave again. I need answers. You can't expect me to just forget all of this and go back to my life like none of it ever happened." Richard stopped, his hand gripping the back of the booth, his eyes meeting David's with a mix of regret and fear. "I never wanted you involved in this, David. That's why I stayed away for so long. I thought if I left you and your mother out of it, you'd be safe. But I was wrong. I should have known that my past would catch up with me eventually." David stood now, his body trembling with the intensity of the situation. The diner, which had been a place of refuge for his father, now felt like a trap closing in. The police were outside, waiting for the right moment to move in. Any second now, they would storm the diner, and his father would be taken away. But as much as David wanted justice, as much as he wanted to hold his father accountable for the years of pain and abandonment, he also felt the overwhelming pull of the bond between them, the bond of a son still longing for the father he had lost. Richard stepped closer to David, lowering his voice. "There are things you don't know, things that would put you and your family in danger if you got too close. The people I was involved with, they're not just criminals, David. They're ruthless. They don't leave loose ends. I've been looking over my shoulder for 30 years, and I can't drag you into that." David's breath caught in his throat. The idea that his father had been living in fear for 3 decades was almost too much to comprehend. This wasn't the life he had imagined for the man who had once been his hero. But at the same time, David couldn't shake the anger and betrayal that had been festering inside him for so long. His father had chosen this life, and in doing so, he had left David and his mother to pick up the pieces. "You could have come back," David said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You could have explained everything. We could have figured something out together. But instead you left us. You left me to think you were dead. Do you know what that did to Mom? Do you know what it did to me?" Richard's face twisted with guilt, and for a moment, David saw the pain in his eyes, the regret of a man who had made too many wrong choices and couldn't find his way back. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered, "but I realize now that I only made things worse." David swallowed hard, the emotions swirling inside him: anger, sadness, confusion, and something else, something more primal: love. Despite everything, despite the years of absence, the lies, the betrayal, he still loved his father. And that was the hardest part of all. He couldn't hate him, no matter how much he wanted to. Before David could respond, the bell over the diner's door jingled, and both men turned sharply. 2 figures stepped inside, dressed in plain clothes, but with an air of authority that was unmistakable. David recognized them immediately as Detective Harris and Detective Morales. His stomach dropped. The police had arrived. Richard's eyes flicked from the detectives to David, and for a split second, everything hung in the balance. David could see the realization dawning in his father's eyes. He knew. He knew that David had led the police to him, that this meeting had been a trap. David. Richard's voice was low, full of betrayal and sadness. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, David saw his father not as the larger-than-life figure from his childhood, but as a broken man, weary from years of running. David's throat tightened, but he couldn't find the words. He had made his choice, but now that the moment had come, it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. Harris and Morales approached the booth slowly, their hands hovering near their belts, ready for any sudden movement. The atmosphere in the diner shifted, the tension thickening. The truckers at the counter turned to watch, sensing that something serious was about to go down. "Richard Parker," Harris said calmly, his voice steady but authoritative. "We need you to come with us." Richard's eyes didn't leave David's. There was no anger in them, just a deep sadness. "I never wanted this," he whispered. "I never wanted you involved." David's heart was in his throat. He could feel his father's pain, and in that moment, he wanted to scream, to tell him that this wasn't his fault, that he hadn't wanted it to go this way. But it was too late. The police had come, and his father's fate was sealed. Harris took a step closer, his handcuffs ready. "Let's make this easy, Mr. Parker. We don't want any trouble." For a moment, Richard seemed like he might resist. His eyes flicked to the door, to the window, calculating the chances of escape. But then he let out a long, defeated breath and slowly raised his hands. The years of running were over. He had nowhere left to go. Harris moved in quickly, securing the handcuffs around Richard's wrists, while Morales kept a watchful eye on the surroundings. The whole thing took less than a minute, but to David, it felt like it happened in slow motion. His father, the man who had been a ghost in his life for so long, was now standing in front of him, handcuffed and defeated. As Harris and Morales led Richard toward the door, David's legs felt like lead. He wanted to move, to say something, but he couldn't. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had just happened. Just before they reached the door, Richard turned back to David, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and something else, perhaps pride or maybe understanding. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for everything." And then he was gone, led out into the night by the detectives. The door swung shut behind them with a dull thud, and the diner fell silent. The truckers went back to their meals, the waitress resumed wiping down the counter, and the quiet hum of the TV filled the room once again. David stood there, frozen, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. His father was gone, this time for good. There would be no more running, no more hiding, no more shadows lurking at the edges of his life. But as much as David had longed for this closure, it didn't feel like the victory he had imagined. Instead, it felt hollow, like something precious had been lost forever. He sank back into the booth, his hands trembling as he buried his face in them. The tears came then, hot and bitter, as the reality of what had just happened crashed over him. His father had been a criminal, a man on the run from his own choices. But he had also been a father, a man who had tried, however imperfectly, to protect his family from the consequences of those choices. And now, it was over. The past could never be undone, but the future stretched out before David, uncertain and filled with questions he wasn't sure he could answer. As he sat there in the quiet of the diner, the thought that echoed most clearly in his mind was simple, yet profound. What now? That was the question he would have to live with, the question that would haunt him as he tried to rebuild the life his father had left in ruins. David remained in the booth long after his father was taken away, the hum of the diner blending into the background noise as his mind raced through everything that had just unfolded. The weight of it all settled deep in his chest, making it hard to breathe, as if the walls were closing in around him. His father, the man who had been at the center of his childhood and the ghost haunting his adult life, was now gone. And while it should have brought a sense of finality, of closure, all David felt was emptiness. He stared at the cold cup of coffee sitting in front of him, untouched, and wondered how he had ended up here. The events of the last few days, the revelations about his father's criminal past, the years of lies. It all felt like too much to process. He couldn't stop thinking about his father's final words. "I'm sorry. For everything." They echoed in his mind, over and over, like a broken record, but they didn't give him the comfort he wanted. It wasn't enough. The door to the diner jingled again, and Detective Harris walked back in, his expression somber. He made his way over to David, sliding into the seat across from him without a word. The silence stretched between them for a long moment before Harris finally spoke. "You did the right thing, David," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but you did." David didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he believed that. Sure, he had done what the law required, what logic told him was right. But in his heart, it felt like a betrayal, not just of his father, but of the man David had been hoping his father still was. The man who had faked his death all those years ago to keep them safe, who had lived in the shadows to protect his family. But now, that man seemed more like a myth, a story David had told himself to fill the gaps in his life. "What happens to him now?" David finally asked, his voice hollow. Harris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "He'll be charged with a laundry list of crimes. Bank robberies, fraud, evading arrest. And there's the incident involving the security guard. If convicted, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." David nodded slowly, the weight of that reality settling over him. It was what he had expected, but hearing it spoken out loud made it more real, more permanent. His father had run for so long, and now it was finally over. There would be no more hiding, no more aliases, no more running. But there would also be no more chances for redemption, no more opportunities to make things right. "Does he even have a chance?" David asked, his voice almost a whisper. Harris hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really. The evidence is overwhelming. His past caught up with him a long time ago, and now, there's no escaping it." David looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. He felt like he should say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all he could think about was his mother. She had lived the rest of her life, believing that her husband had died in that car crash. She had mourned him, grieved him, and tried to build a life for herself and David without him. And now David had learned the truth, a truth that would have destroyed her if she had been alive to hear it. Harris cleared his throat, snapping David out of his thoughts. "I'll make sure you're kept informed about the case, but for now, you should go home. You've been through enough." David nodded, but he didn't move. The idea of going back home, back to his family, seemed impossible. How could he explain any of this to them? How could he tell Lisa and the kids that their grandfather had been alive all these years, hiding from the law, and that David had been the one to bring him down? It was a burden too heavy to bear, and he wasn't sure he could carry it alone. Harris stood, leaving a business card on the table. "Call me if you need anything," he said before walking out of the diner, leaving David alone once again. After what felt like an eternity, David finally rose from the booth, his body stiff and heavy. The walk to his car felt surreal, as if he were moving through a fog. The night air was crisp, and for a brief moment it cleared his head. He stood by the car, taking in deep breaths, trying to ground himself in the present moment. But no matter how hard he tried, the weight of the past kept pulling him down. The drive home was long and silent. The usual hum of the car's engine, the familiar sights of the town as he drove through it, none of it felt the same anymore. Everything had changed. The town felt smaller, colder, like it had lost its sense of safety and simplicity. The truth about his father's past had tainted everything, casting a shadow over his life that he knew would be hard to shake. When David finally pulled into the driveway of his house, the lights were still on inside. Lisa had been waiting for him, and as he stepped through the door, her eyes immediately locked onto his. She could see the exhaustion, the pain in his face, and without a word, she walked over and pulled him into her arms. David collapsed into her embrace, his body trembling as the weight of everything he had been holding in finally broke free. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. Lisa held him tighter, her hand gently stroking his back. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's going to be okay." David wanted to believe her, but he knew it would take time before anything felt okay again. They stood there in the entryway for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, before David finally pulled away. He looked at Lisa, his eyes filled with sorrow, and she nodded, understanding without him having to say anything. She guided him to the couch, where they sat together in silence. After a few moments, David spoke, his voice raw with emotion. "He's gone, Lisa. They took him away." Lisa nodded, her expression soft with sympathy. "What did he say?" David hesitated, the memories of their conversation swirling in his mind. "He said he was sorry. He said he never wanted me involved, that he was trying to protect us. But I don't know if I believe him. I don't know what to believe anymore." Lisa took his hand in hers, her grip firm but comforting. "It's going to take time to make sense of all this. You don't have to figure it out right now." David nodded, but the question still gnawed at him. He had wanted answers, and in some ways, he had gotten them. But they hadn't brought the closure he had hoped for. Instead, they had left him with even more uncertainty, more doubts about the man his father had been and the choices he had made. The next few days passed in a blur. The news of Richard Parker's arrest spread quickly through the town, and while most people didn't know the full story, there were whispers, rumors about who he had been and what he had done. David kept to himself, struggling with the burden of knowing the truth. He avoided conversations with neighbors, dodged calls from friends, and spent most of his time at home with Lisa and the kids. One evening, a week after the arrest, David sat on the back porch, staring out at the darkening sky. The air was cool, and the scent of fall hung in the air, reminding him of simpler times. He thought about his father, about the choices that had led them both to this point. He wondered what his father's life had been like all those years, living in fear, always looking over his shoulder. Had he ever been happy? Or had his past haunted him the way it now haunted David? As the stars began to appear overhead, David realized that he might never get the answers he truly wanted. His father was gone now, and the life they could have had together was lost forever. But even in the midst of his grief, there was a small part of him that felt relief. The running was over. The lies, the secrets, they were out in the open now. And though it would take time, David knew he had the chance to rebuild his life, to move forward without the shadow of his father's choices hanging over him. As he sat there, the quiet night surrounding him, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding for days. Could he forgive his father? The answer didn't come easily, and David knew it would be a long time before he could truly answer it. But for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was possible. And as he stared up at the sky, the thought brought him a small sense of peace. What would you have done?